November 1942. The rain falls in sheets over the black jungle of Guadalcanal. I imagine the air thick with rot, cordite, and fear. Somewhere ahead, an American patrol creeps forward, rifles raised, boots sinking into mud. Suddenly, a lone Japanese soldier stumbles out of the darkness. He is wounded. Blood soaks his uniform. For a moment, it looks like he is surrendering. Then he smiles, grips a grenade, and pulls the pin. In a flash of fire and steel, both sides are reminded of a terrifying truth of the Pacific War. Many Japanese soldiers did not fear death. They feared surrender more. I have spent years studying this question, and every time I return to it, the same mystery grips me again. Why did Japanese soldiers, time and again, choose certain death over capture? Why did men fight on when ammunition was gone, food was gone, hope was gone? Why did they leap from cliffs, charge machine guns, or turn grenades on themselves rather than raise their hands? The answer is not simple. It is not madness, and it is not merely bravery. It is a carefully constructed system of belief, discipline, fear, and honor, one that transformed surrender into something worse than death itself. At the beginning of the war, Allied commanders were baffled. In Europe, soldiers surrendered by the thousands. In North Africa, entire units laid down their arms. But in the Pacific, Japanese positions often had to be annihilated to the last man. Prisoners were rare. When they were taken, they seemed broken, detached, almost reborn. Something fundamental was at work here, something far deeper than battlefield tactics. To understand it, I must go back before Pearl Harbor, before China, even before the First World War. The roots lie in how modern Japan reshaped ancient ideas for modern war. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Japan transformed itself from a feudal society into an industrial military power. In that process, concepts drawn from Bushido, the way of the warrior, were stripped of nuance and turned into absolute rules. Loyalty became obedience. Honor became death before disgrace. The individual ceased to matter, only the group, the emperor, and the nation remained. By the 1930s, this philosophy had been weaponized. Young boys in schools were taught that surrender was shameful. Soldiers were told that capture meant torture, humiliation, and the erasure of their family's honor. In 1941, on the eve of total war, the Japanese army issued a document that crystallized everything: the Senjinkun, the Code of Battlefield Conduct. I have read its words many times, and they are chilling in their clarity. Do not live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying, you avoid leaving a stain on your honor. This was not a suggestion. It was doctrine. Unlike Western military codes, which balanced duty with survival, the Senjinkun demanded self-annihilation if necessary. It told soldiers that death was a duty, that capture was betrayal. Wounded men were not to fall into enemy hands. Airmen whose planes were damaged were expected to crash or kill themselves. Officers who surrendered their troops could face prison, even if surrender saved lives. In effect, the Japanese army erased surrender as a legitimate option. The problem this ideology was meant to solve was not moral, it was strategic. Japan knew it was outmatched industrially by the United States and Britain. It could not win a long war of attrition. What it could do was raise the psychological cost of victory. If every island had to be paid for in blood, if every soldier fought to the last breath, perhaps the enemy would tire, negotiate, or hesitate. Death became a force multiplier. On paper, Japanese units were not always superior in weapons. Their rifles were reliable but outdated. Their machine guns were lighter but often underpowered. Their tanks were thin-skinned. Their artillery was limited. But the human element, the willingness to die, changed the equation. Defensive positions were dug deep, concealed expertly, and manned by troops who had been told there was no retreat. In battle after battle, Allied forces encountered resistance that seemed irrational, even suicidal, yet it achieved its purpose. It slowed advances and inflicted fear. I think of Buna, of Tarawa, of Peleliu. On Tarawa in November 1943, nearly 700 Japanese defenders were killed. Only around 150 were captured alive, most of them Korean laborers, not Japanese soldiers. The defenders knew relief was impossible. They knew death was certain. And still, they fought. From bunkers flooded by the tide, from shattered concrete, from trenches filled with bodies, they kept firing until silence fell. But the ideology alone does not fully explain it. There was another force at work, darker and more immediate: fear of the enemy. Japanese soldiers were told, relentlessly, that Allied troops were monsters. That Americans tortured prisoners. That surrender meant slow, agonizing death. This fear was not entirely imagined. Japanese troops had committed atrocities across Asia, and many assumed the enemy would do the same in return. Stories circulated of mutilated bodies, of skulls taken as trophies. Even isolated incidents were magnified by propaganda into proof that capture was a fate worse than death. This belief shaped behavior on the battlefield in terrifying ways. Allied soldiers reported Japanese troops feigning surrender, only to detonate grenades at close range. Wounded men would wait until medics approached, then strike. From the Allied perspective, surrender itself became suspect. Hands raised could mean a trap. As a result, many genuine attempts to surrender ended in gunfire. The cycle fed itself. Japanese soldiers expected to be killed if they surrendered, and often they were. Yet cracks did appear. As the war turned against Japan, as supply lines collapsed and reinforcements vanished, morale began to erode. On Okinawa in 1945, thousands of Japanese soldiers did surrender, especially recent conscripts and labor units who had not fully absorbed the old code. I find this deeply important. It proves that the system was not absolute. When indoctrination weakened, when survival instincts resurfaced, surrender became possible. Those who did surrender entered a strange new existence. Many believed they were already dead to Japan. Cut off from family, stripped of identity, they felt no obligation to keep secrets. Allied interrogators were astonished. Japanese prisoners spoke freely, explained unit structures, revealed tactics, corrected maps. They even helped design propaganda to encourage others to lay down their arms. The very ideology meant to prevent surrender made surrendered men unusually cooperative. Life in Allied prison camps was, in most cases, far better than what Japanese soldiers had been led to expect. Camps in Australia, New Zealand, India, and the United States followed the Geneva Convention. Prisoners received food, medical care, and recreation. Baseball games were organized. Classes were taught. To some prisoners, this humane treatment was deeply unsettling. It contradicted everything they had been told. Some felt overwhelming shame. Others felt relief. A few attempted escape or suicide, unable to reconcile survival with honor. The most dramatic example came at Cowra, Australia, in August 1944. Over 1,000 Japanese prisoners launched a mass breakout, armed with makeshift weapons, charging machine guns and barbed wire. It was not an escape in the Western sense. It was a final act. By the end, 257 Japanese prisoners lay dead. Many had deliberately sought death. Even in captivity, the code followed them. When the war ended in August 1945, millions of Japanese soldiers finally surrendered. The government issued a carefully worded order, stating that those who laid down their arms after the emperor's rescript would not be regarded as prisoners of war. It was a legal fiction designed to protect honor and prevent chaos. But for those who had surrendered earlier, the stigma remained. Many returned home to silence. Few wrote memoirs. Their stories did not fit the narrative of noble sacrifice. In the Soviet Union, the story was even darker. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese prisoners were sent to labor camps in Siberia. Many died of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Some were not released until a decade later. A few did not return until the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. For them, surrender did not mean survival without cost. It meant years stolen from their lives. When I step back and look at the full picture, the conclusion is unavoidable. Japanese soldiers chose death over surrender not because they loved death, but because surrender had been stripped of meaning as survival. It was defined as moral annihilation. The system told them that a living prisoner was already dead, already disgraced, already erased. In that world, death could seem like the only remaining form of control. This phenomenon reshaped the Pacific War. It intensified battles, increased casualties on both sides, and left a legacy of trauma that lasted long after the guns fell silent. It also stands as a warning. When ideology removes the value of life in favor of abstract honor, war becomes absolute. There is no room for mercy, no space for surrender. Only the slow grind toward mutual destruction. Standing here, decades later, I cannot see these choices as simple fanaticism. They were the result of deliberate policy, cultural manipulation, and fear. Human responses pushed to their limits. Japanese soldiers did not merely fight until death. They were taught that death was the only acceptable ending. And once a soldier believes that, the battlefield becomes a place where survival itself feels like betrayal. That is why, in the jungles, on the beaches, and on the shattered islands of the Pacific, so many chose to die rather than surrender.